Hey, tonight we're peeling back the curtain on the real Wild West. Not that glossy Hollywood daydream full of noble cowboys and clean duels at high noon, but the rough, unwashed, dangerous truth, where just making it through sunrise to sunset was a victory. Think you're tough enough to last a day out there? By the end of this, you might be glad you're only watching from the safety of your couch. If you're enjoying these gritty glimpses into history, it means the world if you tap like or hit subscribe. Helps keep these stories coming. And honestly, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Drop it in the comments. It's always amazing seeing how far this little campfire of ours reaches. All right, lights low, volume up, maybe grab a blanket or turn on a fan for that perfect background hush, because you're about to wake up in the American Wild West of the 1870s. No guide, no safety net, just you, a dirt road stretching to forever, and a land that couldn't care less if you survived the day. Let's see how you do. You open your eyes to a pale beam of light slipping through rough wooden slats, not the filtered glow of your familiar bedroom, but a stark, almost accusing glare that seems to highlight every uncomfortable detail of this strange place. The air greets you first, not crisp or earthy, but thick with an assault of odors that instantly twist your stomach. Sweat gone rancid, stale bedding, the sharp tang of manure, something vaguely sweet yet rotten. It clings to your nostrils, so pervasive it feels almost solid. You shift, and the movement sends a ripple of pain through your shoulders and hips. Beneath you is a mattress that crunches slightly, straw packed into a dirty sack that's flattened unevenly over time, crawling with small, eager life you'd rather not think about. Your muscles ache as though you spent days hauling stones, and in a way you have. Only here, on the frontier, hard labor isn't reserved for the unlucky. It's the baseline expectation. Dragging yourself upright, your joints protest. It feels like the aftermath of an accident you can't remember, but you remember enough to know there's no hospital around the corner, no warm shower waiting, no promise of gentle relief. Outside, a hollow wind sighs through gaps in the rough walls, slipping icy fingers across your skin. Somewhere distant, a dog barks, a thin, wary sound. The bed groans under your weight as you stand, and your bare feet meet a floor gritty with dust and splinters. With every breath you taste the raw wood, the lingering smoke of last night's fire, the pungency of bodies that seldom know soap. Your eyes adjust slowly, taking in the small, dim room, a crude chair, a battered trunk that doubles as a table, a chipped mug with something dark dried inside. Nothing feels clean. In fact, the notion of cleanliness here is nearly alien. You run a hand through your hair and it comes away slightly greasy, smelling faintly of the oil and dirt you lay in. Outside this cabin, or hut, or whatever name you'd slap on a handful of nailed boards, sprawls a world so unforgiving it makes your fragile morning discomforts seem trivial. But those discomforts are your first lesson. Your body is already telling you how poorly suited it is for life in this rugged expanse. Standing there, with your spine trying to uncoil from the cramped night, it hits you that survival here is not about moments of heroism. It's about enduring 1,000 small insults, aches that never vanish, skin rubbed raw by rough shirts, lungs that burn from cold mornings. It's about the quiet, relentless wearing down that doesn't make it into stories. And as the realization settles in your chest, heavy as river stones, you understand that out here, the fight isn't dramatic. It's constant, and it starts the moment you open your eyes. Your stomach knots, not just from hunger, but from the uneasy certainty that this place will demand everything of you. Muscle, bone, stubbornness,
and a willingness to wake up again tomorrow to the same aches. Outside, life continues without pity. A faint smell of wood smoke drifts in again, mingled with something sharper. You swallow hard. Daylight is waiting, and it won't be kind. You fumble for your boots, lying tipped over by the door, and turn them upside down, slapping their heels together. A small, coiled shape falls out and quickly slithers away into a crack. It takes your heart several thuds to slow. Here, even the simple act of getting dressed carries stakes your old life never demanded. Every morning is a gamble. Every step outside is a negotiation with hazards that don't care how unprepared you feel. You take a deep breath, which proves to be a mistake. The tang of the air makes you cough, and the sound echoes harshly in the hollow room. It's time to step out and face this alien land, because inside or outside, discomfort is your constant companion. When you push open the rough door, it protests on its hinges, and sunlight pours over you. Not warm and friendly, but glaring, merciless. It exposes everything, the hard-packed dirt beneath your feet, the sagging fences that look ready to surrender to the wind, the distant shapes of other shacks or cabins all crouched low against a horizon that feels miles closer than any sky you've known.
And there, in that first breath of open air, you realize with a sinking certainty that your chances here aren't just slim, they're nearly imaginary. This is a place that takes no special joy in ending you. It simply doesn't notice you're alive at all. Your survival from this hour on is entirely your problem. And as your stomach growls again, an insistent ache that promises to haunt you through the day, you step into the raw reality of the frontier, hoping your body and mind can pay the price this land demands. The day stretches before you, vast and indifferent. Somewhere a rooster crows, a sound that might seem charming, if not for the other noises that follow. Hooves clattering on stone, a distant shout, the weary creak of wagons starting their slow grind through mud or dust. You set out, trying not to limp too obviously on joints that already feel older than they should. The ground is uneven, littered with rocks and patches of thorny weeds. Each step is a careful calculation. Not far off, smoke curls from a chimney, carrying with it a scent that might promise breakfast if you're lucky, though more often it's the sharp, fatty smell of pork or beans stewing too long. You realize with a small shock that this is how people live here, not in moments of adventure, but in an endless series of uncomfortable tasks that keep hunger and cold just barely at bay. No one here expects life to be gentle. They expect to endure. And already, though you've only just woken to this world, you understand why so few truly flourish. This place does not soften for anyone. You step further into the morning, hoping the brisk air might somehow wash away the heavy stink clinging to your skin, clothes, even your hair. It doesn't. The smell is deeper than mere dirt. It's the scent of sweat that's settled into fabric for weeks, of skin that's rarely touched more than a damp rag, of a whole community living in close quarters without the luxury of real baths. Out here, washing is a rare event. The water it takes to fill a tub is too precious, guarded for drinking and cooking, not squandered on the indulgence of scrubbing away grime. Most folks you pass look as tired and coated with filth as you feel. Their faces are lined not just by sun and hard work, but by the crust of dust that sticks stubbornly around eyes and along hairlines. Hands are permanently stained by soil, grease, animal blood, all ground into rough skin by endless labor. You catch yourself absently scratching at your scalp, feeling where sweat and grit have formed a waxy layer. It itches like a punishment, but scratching only spreads the irritation, and the tiny scabs on your arms tell you your fingernails aren't as clean as they should be either.
When people do bathe here, it's often little more than a splash in a basin, if they're lucky enough to have one. A full immersion is a monthly ritual at best, sometimes stretching into seasons. Through the long winters, many don't undress at all, sleeping in the same garments they wear by day. Washing might mean a wipe with a damp cloth, just enough to smear the worst dirt aside. Even hair is seldom truly clean. Grease is combed back, tied up or hidden under hats and bonnets, and the lice that thrive there are treated as annoyances, not emergencies. The cabins and small homes that dot this settlement add to the problem. Their walls are rarely sealed tight, letting in drafts and, more dangerously, letting out every hint of sewage and refuse that's poured close by. Without proper outhouses for every house, some don't even bother to dig holes deeper than a shovel's length. The waste seeps into the ground where rain can wash it under foundations. When storms come, the thin rivulets of water pick up everything in their path, carrying it along the muddy lanes. The streets become shallow rivers of muck. Children wade through them without thought, tracking filth back into their homes. Adults trudge through it too. There's nowhere else to step. Disease loves these streets. It hides in every careless splash of water from a bucket, every fly that leaps from a manure pile to a cooking pot. The people here know sickness intimately. They see it in the swollen bellies of neighbors whose bodies can't keep food inside, in the hacking coughs that echo through thin walls, in eyes that glaze over and fail to clear again. Illness isn't rare, it's expected. The only uncertainty is who will fall next and how long they'll linger in fever before the body either pushes through or doesn't. And yet, with all this clear evidence of how filth poisons them, people continue to treat water for bathing as a scandalous waste. Barrels and cisterns stand carefully guarded. Wells are precious, sometimes claimed by entire families or shared grudgingly by a few households who squabble if one takes more than their share. To use good water to wash your hair seems foolish when your children need it for porridge, when your animals are gasping in the heat. Cleanliness becomes a distant luxury, a practice for those who live where rivers run clear and wells never run dry.
The irony is that in their effort to ration life's most basic resource, they create the perfect cradle for the very illnesses they fear. Skin breaks under layers of grit. Tiny cuts become angry and swollen. Fleas and lice burrow deeper, bringing with them fevers no one understands. And so entire towns become ticking clocks of infection ready to spill over into tragedy at the smallest push. An outbreak of cholera here, a wave of typhoid there, all waiting to see who is strong enough to endure. Moving through this world, you feel not just dirty, but vulnerable in a way that goes far beyond the surface. You realize that every breath carries invisible risks, that the very people you meet on the path might be unknowingly sharing the seeds of the next sickness. Even a simple handshake, a neighbor's casual arm around your shoulders, could mean days later you'll be curled on your straw mattress, burning up from inside. And still, life goes on. Children laugh, chasing stray dogs. Women gather at wells, gossiping over buckets. Men slap each other on the backs, oblivious to the clouds of dust and sweat stirred up between them. Because here, survival doesn't wait for comfort. It simply continues, dirt and all, because there is no alternative. Clean or not, they keep living. It's only later, under a new sun, that some don't wake up at all, and even then, life trudges forward without them. You wipe sweat from your brow, smearing it with the same hand you just used to brush away a fly, and you realize, with a hollow sort of acceptance, that here, dirt is as much a part of life as breath. And perhaps that's the most unsettling revelation of all, that in this place, grime and sickness are not tragedies. They're the background hum of existence. You step outside into a light that seems too bright, almost punishing, only to be met by a chill so sharp it cuts through your layers in an instant. Out here, there's no polite buffer between seasons. When it's cold, it burrows straight into your bones. Winter on the frontier doesn't stop at your doorstep. It follows you inside, settling comfortably among your few possessions, nestling under your blanket to wait out the long nights right beside you. Your cabin does little to keep the outside world at bay. Gaps between rough boards leak drafts that snake around your ankles and creep up your spine. Even on still days, the wind finds ways to whisper through the cracks. You might pile furs and extra shirts on top of yourself, but it's a feeble defense against air that can be 20 degrees below freezing right there in your own room. A fireplace, if you're fortunate enough to have one, is never kept burning all night. It eats through precious fuel at a reckless pace. So instead of basking in warm coals, you shiver under thin covers, hoping morning will come before the cold tightens so hard around your chest you wake coughing. Then, somehow, seasons turn without easing up on their cruelty. The same thin walls that let winter stroll inside now stand powerless against the blistering sun. By midday, your cabin is an oven. The air hangs heavy, unwilling to move. Sweat breaks out and trickles in salty lines down your ribs, pooling in places where fabric clings too close. You feel grimy almost immediately, but there is no relief to be found, no fan, no cool tiles. The only breeze might be what you stir up by waving your hat. Stepping outside doesn't help. The sun smacks you straight in the face, wrapping your shoulders in an invisible weight. Your mouth dries out after a few breaths, and already you're calculating how much water you can spare for a sip. The ground itself radiates heat, baking your boots from the soles up. Yet no matter how oppressive the day grows, shedding layers isn't an option. Out here, clothing does more than spare modesty. It guards skin from punishing rays and vicious insects. Men sweat through coarse shirts and heavy trousers. Women endure tight stays, layered skirts, cotton chemises that trap heat like a kiln. The dresses drag along dusty ground, gathering filth and stirring it back up into the air to be breathed again. When evening comes, it's tempting to think night will bring relief. Sometimes it does. More often it simply flips discomfort into another form, the heat draining away so quickly that hours later you're burrowed under every scrap of fabric you own, teeth chattering as if the sun never burned at all. You pull the blankets up to your chin and roll onto your side, hoping to sink into sleep despite the rough lumps and suspicious rustlings beneath you. Because that's another reality of these nights. Your mattress is a canvas sack stuffed with straw, or perhaps grass, or even moss if that's all you had when you made it. Over time, the stuffing shifts into ridges and pits that press into your ribs and hips until you ache. Worse yet, it becomes a haven for things that creep and bite. Bedbugs thrive in the seams, emerging to feed just as you finally doze off. You scratch reflexively at your arms, legs, the back of your neck. Tiny red welts bloom in clusters, proof of a night spent as their unwilling feast. This is not some passing discomfort you get used to. It's a constant rotation of miseries. Too cold, too hot, too damp, too dry. You wake stiff and sore from bad sleep on a bad bed, muscles locking up from hours spent curled in defensive knots against cold or insects. And every morning, the thought repeats like an unwelcome mantra. There is no true comfort here. Not in your bed, not in your house, not even in the embrace of the sun or the shade. This land is magnificent, yes, but it was never built for softness. And neither, it seems, were the people determined to survive upon it. The hunger follows you everywhere, like a quiet shadow that never quite leaves your side. Out here, meals aren't moments of delight or satisfaction. They're simply pauses in the day where you stuff something into your mouth to keep from collapsing. The frontier diet is built on what's durable, cheap, and available, not what's appetizing. Beans simmered until they nearly fall apart, slabs of pork salted so heavily they make your tongue burn, hard biscuits that crumble into gritty lumps. If you're lucky, there's a scrap of butter to smear on the bread. though it's often more rancid than fresh. Mornings start with a metal cup of coffee so dark it borders on tar, boiled beyond recognition. There's no gentle drip brew or delicate pour-over ritual here. Grounds are dumped straight into the pot, water added, then left to seethe over a flame until the bitter scent fills the room. Some clever souls add crushed eggshells to settle the sludge at the bottom, or even a pinch of salt to soften the harsh bite. The first sip is always a shock, but the warmth and sharp jolt to your nerves is worth the grimace. By the second swallow, you stop noticing how unpleasant it truly is. Lunch might be more of the same beans reheated, or cold slices of yesterday's pork if there's any left. Sometimes there's jerky, tough strips you have to gnaw for minutes just to soften enough to swallow. It's meat reduced to a nearly indestructible form, dark and leathery, loaded with salt to the point it makes your lips crack. A special treat might be a piece of bread dunked in gravy, thin and oily, mostly flavored by whatever bones were left after a stew. And if there's pie, it's likely made of dried apples rehydrated from sacks stored in the corner, a dusty luxury that still manages to taste of old wood and the must of last year's harvest. Vegetables, when you see them at all, are brief visitors. They appear in the late spring and vanish as quickly as the first frost comes to claim them. Peas, beans in green form, maybe a cabbage if the ground was kind. These you savor not for taste, but because your body cries out for them in ways you don't fully understand. Your gums bleed when you brush. Tiny purple bruises blossom across your shins. People call it spring fever, or simply weakness, not always connecting the dots to the absence of fresh greens. Scurvy isn't some sailor's affliction out here. It stalks the plains and the valleys, settling into mouths until teeth loosen and small cuts refuse to heal. Dinner might look just like breakfast. A pot of beans, some coffee gone stale on the stove, revived with a fresh splash of water and set back to boiling. If someone managed to shoot a rabbit or a brace of birds, there might be meat in the stew, tiny bones hidden in the broth you crunch between your teeth. Salt is the uninvited master of every meal, necessary to keep meat from spoiling, yet slowly robbing bodies of hydration, tightening skin around knuckles, drawing lines deeper into faces already aged by sun and worry. You eat not because you long for flavor, but because there's work to be done, and an empty belly makes every chore harder. Out here, a meal is fuel, nothing more. It goes down without ceremony, often standing up, spoon clanking against the side of a tin bowl, thoughts already on the next task. You wipe your mouth with a sleeve that smells faintly of sweat and wood smoke, then move on, leaving behind the small hope that tomorrow might bring something different. Though in truth, tomorrow will taste very much like today. And so it continues, day after day, until the lack of variety becomes its own subtle predator, wearing down bodies in slow increments, a patient thief that steals vitality long before it ever truly breaks you. Each dawn greets you with a simple ritual, one that feels almost laughable in its smallness, yet might be the thin line between greeting the evening or never seeing it at all. Before you even think of sliding your feet into your battered boots, you pick them up and give them a sharp, practiced shake. The sound of pebbles rattling around inside is a small relief. Far worse would be the dry whisper of scales, or the sudden slap of something soft and alive tumbling out. Snakes favor dark, cramped places during the cool of night, and your boots are perfect dens. Scorpions, too, curl up in the toe with their tails coiled tight, waiting for a warmth they mistake for safety. The simple habit of flipping your footwear upside down, thumping them against the post outside your door, becomes as instinctive as breathing. Those who forget, those still groggy from rough sleep, sometimes pay dearly for the oversight. A single fang strike, a sudden burst of searing pain, and then hours, perhaps days,
a fever and swelling that may or may not pass. Out here, medicine is hope dressed up in different words, and hope doesn't always keep you on your feet.
And it isn't just the small, hidden dangers that put a careful edge on your mornings. Once your feet are safely encased in leather, you step outside to a world that watches you back. Eyes gleam in the underbrush. Tracks crisscross the damp dirt, some delicate as a bird's footprint, others wide enough to make your heart stumble. Cougars range these hills, their silent paws carrying bodies powerful enough to break a man's spine with a single pounce. Wolves roam in packs, lean with hunger, their breath steaming and early cold as they test the borders of your camp, looking for livestock first but never completely discounting the human shape if desperation gnaws hard enough. It's not unusual to hear stories around a sputtering lamp of someone who simply vanished. No witness, no scream loud enough to carry, just a smear of blood on leaves come morning. You walk with that knowledge stitched tight into your thoughts. Every rustle snaps your head around. Every crack of twigs under your own feet makes you flinch, a little embarrassed, a little relieved. Even the birds overhead carry warnings in their sudden flights. A burst of black wings can mean a predator moves nearby, slipping through the long grass on paws that barely disturb the earth. Sometimes, in the deeper woods, you catch a glimpse of claw marks scored into tree trunks, high enough that you'd have to stretch to reach. They're old signs, maybe days, maybe hours. You never know. So you keep your boots checked and your steps careful. You learn to move your eyes constantly, scanning from ground to tree line to sky. Danger here is woven into the very soil, silent and patient. Each morning when you yank on those boots, after making certain nothing deadly waits inside, you're acknowledging a simple truth of frontier life. Survival is never assumed. It's something you win, moment by moment, through vigilance and habits so deeply carved into your routine they become invisible, until the day you forget and remember only too late. The closer you get to the center of town, the harder it is to ignore the smell. It rolls out to meet you long before the first buildings come into view, an invisible fog of rot and waste that clings to your throat and makes your eyes sting. Your instinct is to breathe shallowly, but that only draws the stench deeper. A sickly cocktail of manure, old blood, spoiled food, and the sour tang of too many unwashed bodies living too close together. There's no paved road here, no neat brick gutters to guide rainwater or waste away. The streets are wide veins of packed dirt that turn to sucking mud after a storm or burst into choking dust when the sun beats down. Into this churn goes everything. Course droppings, which pile up daily as wagons creak through, their drivers too busy to care where their teams relieve themselves. Broken barrels of spoiled grain, puddles of slop tossed from doorsteps. When someone cleans fish or butchers a goat, the scraps often end up right in the road. Dogs prowl through it all, snapping up bits of gristle and snapping at each other. Children play in these streets with bare feet, laughter ringing out as they dart around piles of waste. Their faces are streaked with grime, hands sticky from clutching cheap sweets bought with coins begged from passing strangers. Flies swarm over everything, eyes, mouths, open cuts, moving with perfect disregard from a festering wound on one side of town to the bread cooling on a windowsill on the other. This is simply how it is. No one remarks on it because there's no alternative. The nearest thing to sanitation is the occasional rainstorm that washes the worst of it downhill, though it leaves behind puddles that become breeding grounds for sickness in their own right. When a hard downpour hits, the waste lifts into slurry, swirling around ankles. It soaks skirts and trousers, seeps into shoes, and squelches underfoot as you make your way from one errand to the next. Disease is always close by. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, each one a silent visitor that rides in on a careless handshake or a sip of tainted water. Entire families might fall ill within days of each other. Neighbors murmur superstitions, hang bunches of dried herbs above doors, or smear pungent salves under their noses in a hopeless attempt to ward off the invisible threat. But mostly they keep living. They sweep their stoops in the morning, haggle over bolts of cloth in the afternoon, meet for beer at the saloon in the evening, all while knowing the next cough they hear could be the first sign of yet another wave of sickness. It seems impossible that anyone could grow used to such filth, but the mind is pliable. Over time, the odor becomes part of the air itself. Disagreeable, yes, but expected, like dust on a shelf. When a stranger arrives and recoils, you almost pity them. They don't yet understand that here, filth is more than just common, it's a fact of life. And to survive, you must learn to breathe it in without a second thought. When evening comes and the work finally eases, people drift toward the saloon, drawn by habit more than hope. From the outside, these places look nothing like the polished, lantern-lit havens you might imagine. There are no bright swinging doors that open to reveal a friendly piano player and rows of polished glasses. Instead, you find a rough plank building that leans a little under its own weight, its windows smeared by greasy handprints and dust. Inside, the air is hot and heavy, thick with the smell of sweat and spilled liquor that's soaked so deeply into the wooden floorboards it will never come out. A single lantern or two flickers on crooked hooks, casting wobbly shadows that jump across the walls. The bar itself is a scarred stretch of timber, sticky to the touch. Behind it, shelves hold an uneven collection of bottles, many unlabeled, their contents questionable at best. This is where cowboys gather, yes, but not the polished figures with clean hats and shiny boots from stories. These men are tired, dirty, their faces sunburned and wind-scored, clothes stiff with sweat and dust. They don't swagger in with a clever line or a wink. They slump onto benches, boots dragging, eager for a drink that might drown the day's aches. But the liquor waiting for them is hardly the fine-aged whiskey of legend. It's more often a harsh, raw spirit cut with whatever the proprietor can find to stretch it. Tobacco juice for color, kerosene or turpentine for bite, even gunpowder to give it what they might call character. A careless swig of this could leave you staggering blind, your vision never fully returning. And yet men line up for it night after night, because out here, the chance to blur the edges of hardship is worth any risk. There's rarely music beyond a hoarse voice trying out a folk tune or the irregular slap of cards on a nearby table. If someone does drag in a fiddle or coax a few notes from a battered piano, the sound is raw and wandering, an accompaniment more to loneliness than to joy. Fights flare easily in this cramped, overheated space. A careless shoulder bump, an accusation whispered too loud, a misunderstanding over who won the last hand of poker. Suddenly, fists are flying, or worse, a knife is drawn. Blood on the floorboards joins the sticky patchwork of old spills, and by morning it's just another dark stain among hundreds. Still, every night people come. They lean their elbows on the bar, knock back drinks that burn all the way down, and pretend for a little while that the dust, the cold, the threats waiting in the dark just outside these thin walls don't matter. The saloon offers them a fragile, dangerous comfort, a place to forget, even if only for an hour, even if the forgetting might cost them dearly in ways they won't fully realize until it's far too late. Most nights in town might start with laughter and the clink of glasses, but beneath that fragile layer of cheer, something tense always lurks. The streets themselves seem to hold their breath, as if waiting for the inevitable moment when a careless spark sets off trouble. It doesn't take much. A few sharp words exchanged over a card game, a jostled shoulder near the bar, someone glancing a second too long at another man's horse or wife. Suddenly voices rise, hands reach for belts, and what follows is rarely anything like the elegant duels from dime novels. There are no neat showdowns at high noon, no two men standing with perfect posture, eyes narrowed under wide brims, waiting for an invisible signal to draw. In truth, most gunfights on the frontier erupt sloppy and loud, fueled by too much rot-gut liquor and nerves stretched thin by months of hardship. A pistol might clear its holster half-cocked, waving dangerously before it ever levels at a target. Shots ring out in confused bursts, bullets punching through walls and shattering glass, sometimes striking nothing at all except the unlucky soul trying to get out of the way. People duck instinctively. Those who've lived here long learn the warning signs, voices that go suddenly flat, hands dropping to rest too casually on gun butts, and they know when to slip behind a door or press tight against the nearest building. Even so, stray rounds have no sense of justice. They find whoever happens to be in their unpredictable path. A traveler stepping out of the livery stable with a saddle over his shoulder. A boy running errands with a loaf of bread tucked under his arm. A woman crossing from the well, her skirt catching dust that moments later blooms red. Afterward, the street stands stunned. Gunsmoke coils lazily upward, stinging eyes and noses. One man might still be shouting, waving his revolver as if daring anyone to challenge what's just happened. Another clutches a shoulder or staggers against a post, trying to understand why everything feels so far away. And the bystanders watch, silent except for the sharp breaths drawn through their teeth, each calculating how close they came to being drawn into this ugly lottery. The myths of honor and formal dueling only serve to sweeten tales told later by those who want to believe in a kind of rugged nobility. They forget that most confrontations start not with grand moral stakes, but with small, stupid provocations. A bottle cracked over a head, a drunk accusing someone of cheating, a harmless joke that found the wrong ears. By the time pistols appear, it's no longer about the original insult. It's about fear, reputation, panic. Once steel is in hand, pride and caution vanish under the pounding rush of adrenaline. Lawmen, if they're around at all, arrive after the echoes fade. They pick through the scene with weary resignation, marking out scuffed cartridges and noting who's already being carried inside to be tended or laid out. Justice, when it comes, isn't blind so much as pragmatic. If the shooter has friends or money, if the victim was a stranger or already unpopular, the consequences might dissolve into a fine or a quiet agreement to ride on. If the reverse is true, the next sunrise could find a rope slung over the nearest sturdy beam. These grim realities do little to stop the cycle. Tomorrow, the saloons will fill again. Cards will slap onto tables, hands will hover near gun belts, laughter will edge towards something sharper. Because out here, everyone carries too many burdens, too many fears masquerading as swagger, and sometimes the simplest release for all that pressure is a drawn weapon, an explosion of noise, and whatever comes after. The frontier doesn't run on clean stories. It runs on desperation, pride, and the unsteady hands of men who'd rather risk a bullet than back down. If ever there was a place to pray you stayed healthy, it was this raw stretch of country. Falling ill or getting hurt out here wasn't just frightening, it was a gamble with stakes most wouldn't accept if they had any other choice. Because the so-called doctors of the frontier were a breed apart, armed with saws and scalpels, more often than compassion or modern understanding. They meant well, most of them, but their tools were crude, their knowledge a patchwork of outdated theories and dangerous guesswork, and the result was a kind of rough intervention that could be more terrifying than the ailment itself. Step into one of their shadowy offices, and the first thing you'd notice was the smell. Not the sharp tang of antiseptic,
There was none of that, but the thick coppery scent of old blood mingled with sweat and spoiled bandages left too long in the corner. The walls might be decorated with anatomical drawings, yellowed and curling at the edges, as if to reassure patients they were in educated hands. In truth, many doctors had little more than a few months' lecture under their belts, or had apprenticed under another man whose only real experience was in pulling teeth or setting the occasional broken leg. Their treatments followed the old convictions about humors needing balancing. A fever? They might open a vein and let your blood drain into a shallow bowl, certain this would release the illness with it. Sometimes they'd apply leeches instead, cold, squirming things that clung greedily to your skin until they swelled fat and dropped away. If you were lucky, the sight alone might make you faint, sparing you some of the horror.
Poisons were another favored cure. Mercury, arsenic, compounds so toxic they'd make modern hands recoil, were administered as powders or syrups, thought to drive out disease through violent purges. Patients doubled over with cramping guts, sweated through shaking fits, teeth loosening in their gums, not from the illness, but from the cure itself. And yet these same men would nod approvingly, sure the poison was doing its sacred work. But perhaps nothing epitomized frontier medicine like the quick decision to cut. A badly crushed limb from a wagon mishap, a gunshot that shattered bone, these were invitations for the doctor to roll up sleeves and set to work with a saw dulled by years of service. No sterile gowns, no rubber gloves. A leather strap might be offered to bite down on. Whiskey poured liberally down your throat if you were conscious enough to swallow it. Then the blade would start its grim journey, the rasping scrape of teeth on bone echoing through the room. Someone held your shoulders while another gripped the remaining limb, and you hoped to black out before the real agony began. Afterward, a heated iron might be pressed to the stump to seal blood vessels, searing pain and the smell of burnt flesh rising thick and choking. Infection was almost a given. If you understood why washing hands or boiling instruments mattered, if a wound turned hot and red, if foul-smelling pus began to seep, all anyone could do was pray it would drain clean before rot set in deep. It's no wonder many chose to stay home, to lie on their straw pallets surrounded by family, instead of risking the doctor's table. At least there, in familiar dimness, they could avoid the horror of a blade wielded by hands that trembled from fatigue or last night's bottle. They could pass those uncertain days without the taste of mercury on their tongue, without leeches trailing bright lines of blood down their necks. And if things turned truly dire, well, sometimes enduring nature's course seemed a gentler fate than trusting a man whose cure might be worse than the very thing that brought you to him. There's a point in every day when the grind of survival nudges people out of their cabins and dusty shops toward the one fragile promise of comfort most towns can offer. A small, dim eatery that tries its best to call itself a restaurant. From the outside, it doesn't look like much. A wooden sign might creak overhead, hand-painted letters flaking away under sun and wind. A few benches or barrels sit out front, where patrons linger, nursing cups of weak coffee or picking at scraps of salted meat, their faces hollow with fatigue and cautious expectation. Inside, the air is heavy with the mingled aromas of old grease, boiled beans, and whatever stew the cook managed to cobble together that morning. It's not unpleasant exactly. Hunger has a way of softening your standards, but it carries a sour edge if you breathe too deep. Warning of pots that aren't always scrubbed clean and cutting boards that see everything from chicken to wild game without so much as a rinse between tasks. A narrow counter divides the room, behind which stands someone with sleeves rolled to the elbows, moving with brisk efficiency that hides a permanent edge of worry. Keeping food on the table here is its own daily gamble. Supplies come in fits and starts. Prices swing with the moods of distant rail lines and river barges. A shipment delayed by storms means no flour for days, no sugar for weeks. What little arrives costs dearly. Those tins of peaches or sacks of rice might run a man the modern equivalent of $20 or more for a single indulgence. And yet people pay, because what else is there? A plate of the day's fare isn't some colorful spread. It's usually a scoop of beans, a wedge of bread hard enough you might need to dunk it in your coffee just to spare your teeth, and maybe, if luck's on your side, a stringy slice of meat stewed long to soften the toughness. It doesn't matter what animal it was, so long as it fills the hollow space in your belly. Vegetables, when they appear, are boiled until they surrender all texture and most of their color, reducing to a shapeless tangle that tastes mostly of salt. Patrons eat hunched over tin or battered ceramic, shoulders almost touching. Conversation is spare, mostly muttered thanks or mild curses when a fly lands too boldly on the rim of a cup. The real price of a meal here is not just the coin left on the table, but the risk carried home in your gut. Food safety is an idea decades in the future. Meat might be turned slightly before it ever hits the pan, milk sour even when disguised by a sprinkle of sugar. You might wake the next morning with cramps twisting through your middle, a sweat that soaks your shirt, and a desperate hope it will pass quickly. Many times it does. Other times it lingers, dragging you down day by day until your legs can't hold you, and even the thought of eating again turns your stomach. Still, for a brief spell, the little dining hall offers something resembling community. You watch neighbors you hardly know trade quiet news, see young ones dart between tables chasing each other until a stern look sends them back to their plates. Someone might even hum a scrap of a tune. And in those moments, surrounded by the clatter of cutlery and the low murmur of voices trying to pretend at normalcy, you catch a glimmer of what life was meant to feel like. Shared burdens, fleeting pleasures, and a small, fragile hope that tomorrow's meal might taste a little better than today's. Beyond the last weathered fences of town, the world spreads out wide and untamed, a rolling sweep of grasslands and forest that feels both inviting and quietly menacing. It's easy to look at that endless horizon and dream of possibility, of new land, new fortunes, the simple thrill of space that stretches further than the eye can follow. But beneath that open promise lies a complicated, restless tension few newcomers ever fully grasp until it's too late. Stories fly faster than any rider, tales of sudden raids by native warriors sweeping down from hidden hillsides, of settlers found with cold campfires and abandoned wagons. These are the legends that fill frontier nights with nervous whispers, retold over and over until every rustle in the grass becomes a sure sign of an advancing war party. Yet these same stories rarely tell how often such attacks were acts of desperate defense, responses to broken treaties, stolen lands, and the slaughter of buffalo herds that once sustained entire nations. Many tribes tried for years to coexist, offering trade, sharing trails, even guiding travelers who would have otherwise been hopelessly lost. But when promises were betrayed again and again, patience gave way to the same raw instinct that drives anyone to protect home and kin. Truth is, settlers and soldiers were more often the aggressors, pushing lines of homesteads steadily westward, fencing off water, carving up hunting grounds. Skirmishes might break out not because a band of native fighters hunted violence for its own sake, but because hunger and survival forced their hand. And when those conflicts ended badly for the settlers,
the retellings twisted to make heroes of the fallen and villains of the people simply trying to preserve a way of life that had existed long before any wagons cut ruts into these prairies. But danger on the frontier didn't only wear feathers or paint its face. Far more common was the threat posed by men who looked exactly like your neighbors. Bands of outlaws drifted across territories like storm fronts, loosely organized groups that might swell or vanish overnight. They rode with an easy arrogance born from knowing that most local lawmen were spread too thin to stand in their way. A lone sheriff couldn't patrol 1,000 square miles, and when a dozen hardened riders appeared at dawn to circle a ranch or flag down a stage, there was rarely any real resistance.
You learned quickly that when such men blocked the road ahead, the smartest thing to do was comply. Hand over coin, hand over goods, hand over the fresh horse they demanded, keep your eyes low, your voice even, and hope they found no reason to suspect you of hiding something worth more trouble. Pride could get you beaten. Bravado could see you left on the trail with nothing but bruises and prayers that someone else would come along before nightfall. Because out here, the wilderness wasn't the only place with predators. Sometimes the real peril sat right across the table from you at a saloon, or tipped its hat politely as it rode past your wagon train on the same road. The horizon promised freedom, but it also hid countless shadows. And for every tale of noble conquest and fearless pioneers, there were twice as many quieter truths, of travelers who vanished without trace, of settlements that burned in the night, and of a fragile peace that depended on more luck than most would ever admit. Justice out here is a fragile, shifting thing, less a matter of carefully weighed evidence, and more a storm of quick tempers, whispered rumors, and collective fear. The farther you stray from cities with proper courts and officials, the more the law becomes whatever the gathered crowd decides it should be in that heated moment. And that crowd can be terrifyingly easy to stir. It starts small, almost innocently. A horse goes missing from outside a saloon, or a rancher wakes to find his corral gate swung wide, fresh hoofprints disappearing into the hills. Men gather to examine the tracks, voices low and tense. Accusations slip out. Maybe it was that newcomer, the one who's been asking too many questions and carrying too little baggage. Or the quiet hand who never spends his pay in town, who keeps mostly to himself. It doesn't take much to plant suspicion. Once it takes root, it grows faster than any weed. Someone suggests a search, and soon half the town is combing through brush and creek beds, rifles slung over their shoulders, eager to prove their vigilance. When they find the missing horse grazing innocently near a patch of scrub, or worse, tethered at some stranger's temporary camp, the mood hardens. No one wants to admit the truth might be more complicated, that the animal wandered off on its own, or that the stranger simply found it and tied it up to prevent it from bolting further. Instead, the men look at each other, tightening their grips on rifle stocks, waiting for the first voice to declare what should happen next. And once someone says it, once someone mutters about a rope, there's rarely a reversal. The momentum becomes a living creature, hungrily devouring logic and hesitation alike. They march the accused back into town, a tight ring of grim faces surrounding him. He might protest, stumbling over his words, saying he never touched the horse, that he doesn't even ride, that he was just cooking by the river when they came upon him. But his words fall into the hot, dusty air and vanish. Because now it's not really about proof. It's about fear, about setting an example, about showing each other that this town won't tolerate crime, real or imagined. A tree on the edge of the main road becomes the impromptu gallows. Its branches have borne the weight before. Dark stains in the bark tell quiet stories. A wagon bed serves as the platform. A noose is produced, often carried in some saddlebag precisely for this sort of rough justice. The knot is tested, adjusted, thrown over the branch. The crowd presses in. Some avert their eyes, others stare with a harsh, bright interest that makes your stomach twist. The man's hands are tied behind him. Sometimes someone gives a last-minute speech, Let this be a warning, but more often it's silent. The only sounds the creak of the rope and the shallow breathing of men trying not to imagine themselves in those same worn boots. Then the wagon jolts forward, the rope snaps taut, and the gathered bodies flinch in unison. When it's over, people drift away quickly. A few linger to cut down the body or to mutter that it couldn't be helped. Mothers hurry their children inside, avoiding the spot where dust still dances in the sunlight. By evening, conversation turns back to harvest prospects, to whether more settlers might come before winter. Life continues with chilling ease. It's enough to teach any newcomer caution deeper than mere politeness. Out here you learn fast that even innocence offers no armor against a frightened, angry crowd. You keep your stories straight, you pay your debts promptly, you never joke about someone else's property, and you keep watch for signs. A gathering of men outside the general store, their voices low, their shoulders tense. Because out here, law doesn't come with robes and gavels. It comes on horseback, with rough hands and a rope. And if it ever turns its gaze on you, truth might not be enough to save your neck. In this place where wagons grind across endless stretches of dirt, and the nearest real city might be weeks away by stage, the value of things bends strangely, taking on a shape that has more to do with desperation and distance than with common sense. A simple tin of preserved peaches, the kind you'd pass by without a second glance back home, becomes a glittering prize here. When it finally arrives on a shelf, dusty from its long, rattling journey, the shopkeeper treats it almost like jewelry. It might cost as much as $20 modern for that small can, maybe more if the last shipment ran late or bandits struck a supply train. Yet someone will pay it gladly, simply to taste a sweetness that breaks the unending march of beans and salt pork. Sugar is another small miracle. It arrives in burlap sacks, measured out by the pound with a heavy iron scoop. Every grain feels precious enough to weigh carefully in your palm, rationed so strictly that most save it only for the weakest or sickest in the house. Flour, coffee, dried fruits, each is a treasure that flickers in and out of reach, dictated by weather, by luck on the roads, by the health of distant crops you'll never see. It's not just the prices that hurt, it's the unpredictable swings. One month you can afford enough to stock your shelves. The next, you walk out of the mercantile with nothing but the ache of empty hands and the smell of goods you can't touch. Even letters, those thin threads tying you to somewhere else, come at their own high cost. Postage is steep, paid by weight, and mail service is as irregular as rainfall on the prairie. Riders vanish, bags go missing. Entire routes are abandoned when too many attacks happen along the trail. Weeks slip into months without word from your parents or siblings or the friend who promised to join you out here. A single envelope, when it does arrive, might be tattered, sweat-stained from its long ride pressed against a courier's side. You hold it like something breakable, reading and rereading the words until the paper softens under your fingers. The silence in between grows monstrous. Nights stretch long, broken only by the distant bark of coyotes or the clumsy thump of a goat outside the cabin wall. You wonder how many of your old friends still remember your face, whether nieces and nephews born after you left will ever know your name. Even neighbors you see daily can't quite fill the hollow where familiar voices used to live. They have their own burdens, their own gnawing worries. Conversation drifts inevitably back to weather and harvests, to who's come down sick lately, and after a while you find yourself choosing to keep quiet because it feels simpler than trying to explain how badly you miss people who are hundreds of thousands of miles away. So you learn to savor small moments like currency of a different kind. The rare night someone brings out a fiddle, the gentle weight of a child's hand when they crawl into your lap to watch the fire. The crack of dawn that spills new light across fields you're slowly learning to call your own. These cost nothing, but carry a value beyond any can of peaches. Still, every time you see a stage roll into town, hear the postmaster call out names, your heart leaps against your ribs. Because maybe, just maybe, there will be something for you. A slim rectangle of paper covered in loops and slashes that proves someone far off still thinks of you. And for a while, that's enough to quiet the terrible echo of being so very far from where you once belonged. Out here, the horizon stretches so far and flat it tricks you into thinking there's a kind of safety in its openness. But the truth is, there's nothing gentle about this land. Nature has 1,000 ways to remind you how small you really are, each one arriving without much warning and leaving scars that can last a lifetime, or wipe a life away in minutes. Storms roll across the plains in towering walls of bruised clouds, swallowing the sky in shades of iron and lead. Lightning splits the darkness in jagged white rakes, striking so close it leaves your hair lifted and your chest hollowed by the concussion. Thunder crashes over your small cabin, making the walls tremble like frightened animals. Rain comes hard and fast, drumming on the roof in deafening percussion, pouring through every careless gap in the thatch. The floor turns to muck beneath your boots, muddy rivulets sneaking across rooms to pool under beds and trunks. If you're lucky, the wind stays mild. If not, it tears roofs straight off, flings fences into the next county, and sends chickens screeching into oblivion. When the seasons flip, cold settles over the land so swiftly it feels like the sun abandoned its post entirely. Snow doesn't drift down in gentle flakes. It drives sideways in sharp, stinging needles, piling against doors until you have to shoulder them open with all your strength. Whole families wake to find themselves sealed inside by a white wall, scratching at frosted panes to see how deep they're buried. Fires must be fed constantly, every log a precious defense against air that can freeze breath before it leaves your lips. And when wood runs low, you burn whatever you can. Corn stalks, dried dung, anything to keep frostbite from claiming fingers and toes. Then comes spring, and with it water. Creeks that trickled harmlessly for months rise in angry brown torrents, spilling over banks to claw through fields and roads. Wagons get mired axle deep, livestock drown in sudden currents, and those mud brick homes, built because they were cheap, because timber was scarce, soak through until walls slump in slow motion collapse. You see a neighbor's house simply give up one morning, its side bowing out like a rotten fruit before crumbling into a heap of wet straw and clay. Summer's kindness is a lie too. The sun bakes everything under its steady glare, sucking moisture from ground and skin alike until cracks spread through your fields like a web of tiny wounds. Then, just when you dare hope for rain, a different horror sweeps in: fire. A lightning strike miles away can ignite prairie grasses so dry they're nearly tinder. Flames race faster than horses, driven by gusts that howl across open land, devouring everything. You watch lines of orange and black creep closer, your mouth dry with ash and terror, knowing there's little to be done. Dig shallow trenches, soak blankets, pray the wind shifts. Often, it does not. Through it all, people rebuild because there's nothing else to do. They patch mud walls, rethatch roofs with dry grasses bundled by hand, set fences back upright as best they can. Even knowing these homes stand at mercy of the next storm or blaze, they press on. Because for many, there's nowhere else to go. And because this brutal place, for all its tempests and trials, still holds the promise of land to call your own. And so, each morning you step outside and look at that wide, beautiful horizon, shoulders braced, heart wary, hoping today the sky will stay clear and calm, even as you keep one eye always tilted upward,
watching for the next test it's sure to bring. If life on the surface was harsh, what waited underground was something else entirely. A kind of slow, deliberate gamble with the grim odds stacked so high it was almost a wonder anyone ever climbed down into those dark throats of Earth at all. Yet men did, day after day, driven by hunger, by debt, by the shimmering lure of veins of silver or gold promised to lie just beyond the next layer of rock. There was no protective gear here, no sturdy helmets to guard against the rain of loose stones that might at any moment come crashing down. Heads were covered by battered felt hats or nothing at all, hair matted by sweat and dust. The air itself betrayed them. With no real system to vent the tunnels, oxygen grew scarce within a few minutes' walk of the entrance. Miners carried candles or small oil lamps mounted on their caps, and their flames told constant truths. When they burned low or danced strangely, it meant gas was gathering. If the light vanished in a sudden puff, men would hold their breath instinctively, but usually too late. Choking coughs followed, then stumbling blindness as lungs tried and failed to grab clean air that simply wasn't there. Dampness soaked everything. Clothes clung heavily to backs and thighs. Boots squelched through shallow pools where water seeped in and pooled, never quite drained by crude ditches hacked with pickaxes. Walls sweated a mineral slick that stung any cut. Bare skin grew coated in grime until it was impossible to tell where dirt ended and flesh began. The constant hammering and chiseling sent fine dust swirling into every breath. Quartz dust was the worst of it. Miners joked darkly that it gave a man company for life, because once those tiny particles settled into your lungs, they never left. You could be 25 and already hacking like someone 3 decades older, each cough pulling strings of dark mucus from your chest. Sufferers still hauled themselves down ladders each morning, because to stay above ground meant earning nothing, and earning nothing meant starvation. Better to work, to wheeze through it, to hope you'd be one of the rare few whose body somehow endured. Then there were the blasts. Black powder charges were packed into drilled holes, lit with sputtering fuses that gave men barely enough time to scramble around corners or crouch behind half walls of leftover rubble. Explosions went off with vicious concussions that rattled teeth and knocked tools from numb fingers. Rocks sprayed in deadly fragments, and if the ceiling chose that moment to shift, entire sections of tunnel might collapse. A man could vanish in an instant, buried so thoroughly under tons of rubble that the recovery crew didn't even bother trying to dig him out. They'd mark the spot with a rough cross scratched into the wall and move the operation a few yards over. No one spoke much about these dangers in the boarding houses or at supper tables. It was too close to truth. Instead, they swapped stories about the lucky strikes of a man who tapped his pick into what looked like plain stone only to have bright veins spill out, or who found a pocket of nuggets so dense he filled 2 sacks before the foreman ever arrived to claim the larger share. Those tales kept hope alive, kept feet moving down rickety ladders into shafts that smelled of damp rot and fear. And so miners kept digging, day after day, lungs thickening with lethal dust, muscles knotting from stooped labor, skin forever marked by scrapes and burns. Many didn't live to see their children grow. Those who did often found themselves at the edge of the same mine years later, gripping the same splintered handles, teaching the next generation how to swing a pick just right. Because out here, that dark, echoing space underground was often the only place a man could find steady pay. And for most, even knowing what it would cost them in the end, that was reason enough to light another lamp and disappear into the earth once more. From a distance, the open range looks almost poetic. Rolling grasslands lit gold by the sun, herds of cattle moving like slow, patient rivers across the hills. It's easy to fall under the spell of those sweeping vistas and imagine the cowboy's life as one of rugged freedom, a man on horseback with nothing but the wind for company, trailing 1,000 head toward distant railheads. Songs and stories have polished that vision into something near myth. But when you ride into it yourself, dust thick on your tongue and hours of saddle under your spine, the illusion unravels fast. The work starts long before dawn. Cowboys roll out of rough bedrolls on hard ground, blinking sleep from eyes already raw with grit. The smell hits first, smoke from last night's dying fire, mingled with sweat, manure, and damp earth. Clothes are the same they slept in, stiff from old sweat and the dew that settled overnight. Boots go on with a practiced shove, hats jammed low to shield faces still puffy from sleep. Then it's up and into the saddle, horses just as begrudging as their riders. Out there on the trail, it's not the daring show of lariats and daring stunts the dime novels promised. It's hours of slow pacing, shouting at stubborn steers, leaning low to prod a laggard back into line. The sun climbs mercilessly overhead, beating down on broad hat brims, drawing sweat until it soaks collars and runs in salty trails down backs. Eyes ache from squinting against glare, lips crack, hands stay swollen and tender from gripping reins and ropes.
Every so often, one of the animals bolts, spooked by a snake, a sudden shadow, a coyote's distant yip, and then chaos erupts. Cowboys spur their mounts hard, galloping to head off a stampede, voices rising in harsh yells, whips cracking, dust swallowing everything. It's dangerous, fast, brutal work. Hooves churn up rocks that can break a leg, yours or the horse's, before you have time to shout. A single misstep can leave you trampled under hundreds of pounds of panicked beef. When the herd finally calms, you're left shaking, lungs heaving, sweat cold on your skin despite the sun. And there's still miles to go before camp. More stray calves to round up, more chances for the whole restless mass to break and run again. Nights bring no luxury, only the rough ground, the constant chirr of insects, and distant rustle of predators curious about the sleeping buffet. Bedrolls are laid out wherever the cattle stop. Blankets become gritty with dust and crawling things. Ticks and fleas find easy meals among men too tired to care. Snakes sometimes curl close to share residual body heat, and every snap of a twig jerks someone awake, hand already reaching for a revolver. Meals come from blackened pots swung over sputtering fires, beans again, tough coffee that scalds the tongue, maybe jerked meat chewed down until jaws ache. No fresh bread, no vegetables, unless a chuck wagon happened to carry a rare sack of onions or potatoes. The talk around the flames is often low, voices edged with fatigue. Laughter happens, but it's brief, as fragile as the small flames licking at the wood. Days stretch into weeks. Great cattle drives might push north hundreds of miles, across rivers that suck horses under, through sunburned plains that crack underfoot, over hills slick with sudden storms. There's no escape from the weather. Rain soaks every stitch you own. Sun scorches skin raw. Nights can turn bitterly cold, even in high summer. Cowboys pull their hats down and their collars up, cursing softly into their bedrolls, dreaming of dry shirts and warm stoves that exist only in distant memory. Yet when the herd finally reaches its railhead and the long, dusty procession breaks apart, when the pay is counted into calloused palms, thin stacks of silver that must last until the next job, it's still somehow enough to draw them back. Because despite the endless hardship, there's a strange pride in knowing you can weather it, in having faced down storms and stampedes, rattlesnakes and rustlers with only your horse and your nerve to keep you standing. But romance? The glossy dreams sold in painted posters? That was always for someone else. Out here, life was bone-deep grit, sweat that never quite washed off, and a hard-earned satisfaction that didn't shine so pretty, but ran a whole lot truer. They came chasing a promise inked into government proclamations. Free land, 160 acres of it.
theirs just for the taking if they could stake a claim and hold on long enough. For families who'd scrabbled at stony hillsides in the east or squeezed into rented rooms in crowded cities, it sounded like deliverance. A patch of soil to call their own, wide enough that neighbors stood a mile off and no landlord could ever come knocking. They loaded wagons with battered trunks and iron cookpots, set children between barrels of flour and hope, and rolled west until the horizon finally yawned wide. Then they dug in, literally. Sod houses rose first because there were no trees for timber, just endless plains waving with grass. Families carved bricks from the tough earth, stacking them into walls that sweated dark when it rained and crumbled under careless boots. Roofs were layered with more sod, sprouting weeds and sometimes wildflowers alive with insects that dropped onto sleeping faces. Inside, it stayed cool in the summer heat, but come storms, water found every seam, trickling down to soak bedding, pooling on dirt floors until toes pruned and blankets turned sour. Those 160 acres that had sounded so rich on paper proved more treacherous than any fine print. Some stretches were too dry, stubborn ground that cracked in long, jagged lines under a punishing sun. Others sat too low, flooding when spring thaw swelled creeks into greedy monsters that swallowed seed and soil alike. You could watch a season's hope vanish overnight, tiny green shoots flattened under hail, or delicate heads of wheat shredded by winds that galloped unopposed across the plains. Then came the plagues. Locusts, thick enough to blot out the sun, swept in with a hungry chorus that made every tree branch buzz. They clung to crops in squirming clumps, leaving only skeletal stalks behind. Shirts waved like frantic flags couldn't drive them off. Children wept, watching gardens they'd helped plant vanish under clicking jaws. Loneliness sank its teeth in just as deep. Neighbors might live miles away, and visits were rare luxuries. A wife could spend weeks seeing no face but her husband's and her own reflection in a dishpan of cloudy water. Even letters came sporadically, carried by stagecoaches that might be delayed by washed-out roads or bandits. The prairie played tricks on the mind, too. Skies so vast, it seemed they'd press you flat. Winds whispering through cracks in the sod walls at night like ghost voices.
People found ways to cope. Women stitched quilts by lantern light. Men mended harnesses or carved small toys. Some families kept a dog, not just for guarding chickens, but for the comfort of another heartbeat close by. Bible readings, a harmonica tune, shared coffee by candlelight all served as fragile bulwarks against despair. Still, each morning meant stepping outside into another uncertain test. Hands rough with calluses gripped plows. Eyes squinted against dust that stuck in eyelashes. They watched horizons for clouds that might bring rain, or dark bands that could mean locusts returning. And always in the back of their minds was the question, how long could they keep at it before the land finally broke them? Because the prairie was generous only to those it chose to favor, and it cared nothing for the fervent hopes or blistered hands of people who simply wanted to build a life where no one could ever turn them out again. Out on the edge of the world, where fences vanished into the waving grass and roads were little more than faint wheel ruts, the image of delicate femininity had no real place. Women here were anything but fragile ornaments kept behind lace curtains. They were partners in survival, shoulders set just as square, hands just as calloused, hearts carrying burdens no less heavy than any man's. A wife on the frontier was expected to handle as much as her husband, often more. When dawn spilled pale over the prairie, she was already moving, stoking a reluctant fire to coax weak flames into life. Biscuits and salt pork for breakfast, coffee boiled into a dark, bitter fortitude, Then it was out to milk cows, feed chickens, haul water. If her husband was off trading or driving cattle to market, she might hitch up the plow herself, guiding the stubborn blade through resistant soil while children chased grasshoppers beside her. In lean seasons, she hunted small game, her rifle balanced across her lap, eyes sharp for any rustle that meant a rabbit or a wolf. When it came time to bring new life into the world, she did so without much ceremony, and often with no help beyond a neighboring woman who might arrive breathless, aprons still dusted with flour. Birth happened on straw pallets laid over dirt floors, the smell of blood and sweat mixing with smoke from the hearth. There were no sterile linens, no soothing ether to ease agony. Pain was a tide she simply rode out, gritting her teeth on a leather strap or the edge of a folded rag, hoping her cries wouldn't frighten the little ones huddled in the next room. If complications came, there was seldom anything to be done but wait and pray. Too many women disappeared beneath mounds of fresh-turned earth behind sod houses, leaving fathers to cradle infants alone.
Widows were common and forged of iron by necessity. A woman left to fend for herself did not fold into grief for long. Fields still needed tending, wood still had to be chopped, livestock still had to be protected. Many simply picked up where husbands left off, their names on deeds and receipts, driving wagons to distant markets with a rifle laid across the seat beside them. Communities respected them, sometimes with pity, but more often with a wary sort of awe. Not all stories were tidy. They were women who ran boarding houses or saloons on the fringes of town, labeled fallen by local gossips. Yet these women, too, carved out fierce, stubborn independence, managing rooms, cooking meals, juggling debts, and negotiating with rough men in a way that often kept fists, and worse, at bay. They sent money home to aging parents or saved scraps to educate siblings back east. Their lives might have been judged harshly by polite society, but on the frontier, survival had its own raw honor. Whether pouring bullets into molds by candlelight or dragging a stubborn mule from a muddy creek, frontier women proved again and again they were every bit as tough as their male counterparts. The same sun burned their skin dark. The same storms tested their resolve. They endured days so lonely the wind seemed to whisper to them, nights so cold they curled children close just to keep breathing. And when small joys came, fresh bread rising properly, a baby's laugh, a letter from far away, they savored them with an intensity born of knowing how easily such fragile sweetness could vanish. So, if there ever was a place to dismantle the notion that courage wore only boots and broad shoulders, it was here. Women's hands bore scars from plows and axes, from needles and knives alike. Their hearts beat with a quiet ferocity, enduring 1,000 griefs that would have crushed those who believed them merely gentle. On this raw edge of settlement, womanhood was neither frail nor secondary. It was, in truth, the very spine that kept countless families and entire new towns upright and moving forward. Children on the frontier were never simply children. They were small, necessary extensions of the family's labor. Hands that could carry water buckets or pull weeds. Feet that could chase after wandering calves. From the moment they could stand steady and understand simple instructions, their days were spoken for. A boy of 5 might be sent out with a crooked stick to keep the goats from slipping through gaps in a split-rail fence. A girl not much older would be expected to mind younger siblings, sweep the packed dirt floor, stir pots over flames nearly as tall as she was. By 8 or 9, children were trusted with sharp tools. Boys swung axes nearly as big as their thin shoulders could handle, learning to split logs clean by watching fathers or older brothers. Mishaps were common. A misjudged swing could gouge a shin or slice deep into a hand. And there were no doctors to stitch neat rows or administer gentle anesthetics, just a mother's trembling hands and a bottle of whiskey if they were fortunate. Girls wielded knives with a quiet precision, gutting fish, trimming fat from cuts of meat, slicing vegetables for stews that might feed 10 after a back-breaking day in the fields. Their chores began before sunup and often ended long after dusk. Lantern light flickered over small faces bent to sewing, to mending harnesses, to patching worn shirts that must last another season. School, if it existed at all, was a luxury squeezed between planting and harvest, between long stretches of weather too harsh to allow the teacher's tiny clapboard building to stay open. Lessons were crammed into spare months. Fractions and rough penmanship taught by someone who might themselves only be half a step ahead in knowledge. Disease was another constant, an invisible thief that moved easily among small bodies already worn thin by work and poor diets. Measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, each swept through like a cold wind, leaving beds empty and parents hollow-eyed with grief. Graves behind the house were not unusual. Small markers often crowded together under scrubby trees. Sometimes children were buried without proper stones at all, just a pile of rocks to keep scavengers from disturbing the little mound. It was a heartbreak so common, it nearly became routine, though it never lost its sharpness. Even the toughest settlers had voices that broke when they spoke of children lost too soon. Yet, in spite of all this, there were flashes of fierce, bright life. Barefoot races across sun-warmed grass. Shouts of delight when a surprise litter of kittens was discovered in the hay. Giggles as brothers and sisters washed in the same tin tub, splashing more water onto the floor than onto themselves. In the winter, children bundled in mismatched scarves flung snowballs until noses ran and cheeks glowed hot with laughter.
These moments mattered. They were the slender threads that kept families from unraveling under the weight of relentless work and relentless loss. But always, just beneath the surface, was the knowledge that childhood here was fragile. Something lived quickly, with a seriousness in young eyes that city visitors sometimes found unnerving. Because on the frontier, life demanded payment from everyone, no matter how small. And children paid with blisters on tender palms, with lessons learned too early about hunger and sorrow, with futures often measured in handfuls of brief years. Even so, they stood beside their parents at dawn, ready to shoulder a piece of the family's struggle, never knowing any other way to be. When the last ember in the hearth faded to a sullen red glow, night on the frontier came down like a heavy curtain. There were no street lamps to scatter the darkness, no distant windows lit by electric bulbs to remind you that neighbors lay close by. The world simply vanished beyond the small circle of your lantern, swallowed by a depth of black so complete it felt almost alive. Stepping outside meant surrendering to it. The moment you left the threshold, your hand instinctively went to the nearest solid shape, door frame, fence post, even your own chest, as if to tether yourself against the void pressing in. Above, the stars crowded close, a wheeling flood of cold light that made the darkness on the ground seem even deeper. The moon, when it rose, painted long blue shadows that crept across fields and up cabin walls, exaggerating every dip and hollow into hidden layers. Sounds changed too. The chatter of daytime, voices, tools, livestock shuffling through pens, gave way to a hush so broad it seemed to echo. Into that silence came sharper noises. The distant cry of a coyote, high and laughing, answered by another much too near. Branches cracked under something heavier than the wind. Now and then came a rustle in dry grass, stopping and starting again as if deliberately teasing your straining ears. With no glow of a town to push them back, these predators came close, testing corrals, sniffing at doors. Sometimes in the morning, you'd find tracks pressed deep around your porch, clawed and unmistakable.
Inside, families clustered together, lanterns turned low to stretch precious oil. Shadows gathered in corners like silent eavesdroppers. Conversations dropped to whispers, because voices carried oddly in that stillness, swallowed up or thrown back in strange ways by sod walls. Sleep came fitfully. Every unexpected creak of the roof beams set hearts racing. Eyes snapped open at small scuttlings across the floor. Mice, maybe, or beetles drawn by warmth. But in your midnight mind, they might as well be claws. For those newly arrived from cities, the dark was worst of all. It pressed against windows and pooled beneath beds, a living presence that stirred old childhood fears with terrifying ease. More than one homesteader confessed, voice low and ashamed, to lighting extra lanterns just to hold the black at bay, even knowing how precious that oil was. Because in this darkness, imagination had too much room to roam. It built monsters out of the unknown, stitched nightmares from the simple fact that no help lay within shouting distance, that neighbors were hours away across treacherous ground. But there was a kind of awe there too, undeniable and immense. On clear nights when fear loosened its grip, stepping outside could feel like standing at the edge of creation itself. Stars crowded so thick it seemed they might tumble right down onto your shoulders. The Milky Way was not some faint smear, but a radiant river pouring across the sky, and you stood rooted, tiny, and breathless under its sweep. Even then, though, wonder was always twinned with unease, because that same vastness reminded you how alone you truly were, just a fragile scrap of breath and heartbeat under endless dark, in a land that neither knew nor cared if you woke again come morning. In the quiet moments at dawn, when the first wash of pale gold slides across the prairie and turns every blade of grass into a tiny trembling torch, it's not hard to see why people came. The land sprawls in all directions, immense and unbroken, a canvas still mostly untouched by fences or roads. Far off, mountains rear up against the horizon, their peaks hazy with distance, whispering promises of places no plow has ever scratched, no surveyor has ever measured. That sight alone could set something burning inside a person, a longing so deep it overrode memory of every hardship faced to get here. For many, that dream was worth more than comfort or even security. It was the allure of possibility. Back east, land was already claimed, names written into ledgers that left little room for those who came late. Here, you could stake a future literally from the soil under your boots. You could build something, small at first, fragile and makeshift, but yours in a way that no crowded boarding house or rented city apartment could ever be. Even the risk seemed noble, almost holy, wrapped in the language of destiny and manifest promise. But the tragedy of this wild, breathtaking expanse ran as deep as its rivers. The millions who poured westward did not come to empty country. Every mile of waving grass, every forested ridge was already part of a vast, intricate web of life that had balanced itself for ages, long before wagons cut scars into its skin. Native nations had lived here with a closeness to land that settlers rarely understood, tending it in quiet ways,
burning controlled fires to renew prairies, following herds with a rhythm that let them replenish. When newcomers arrived, they brought plows that sliced through delicate root systems, leaving topsoil to blow away with the first hard winds. They hunted buffalo not for food or clothing, but for sport and for hides, leaving rotting carcasses to bleach under a pitiless sun. Rivers clogged with silt and sawdust from hastily erected mills, meadows vanished beneath the blocky grids of new towns. For the people who'd called these places home for generations, the cost was staggering. Treaties made in formal language were broken just as formally. Villages were pushed aside, cultures torn from ancient places and pressed into strange, tight reservations where old ways withered under the pressure of foreign laws and rations that could never replace the hunt. Stories and languages dimmed, lost beneath the weight of a different future that arrived without asking. Yet still, each year more wagons rumbled west, more sod houses rose on ridges, more cattle herds cut deep trails into fragile ranges. Because for those who came, the West was a promise too bright to resist. Its very dangers made it feel more worthy somehow, proof that this land was raw and waiting, a treasure for the bold to claim. Standing there on a slight rise, watching sunlight pour like molten gold over endless miles of swaying grass, you could feel that complicated pull yourself. It was beautiful beyond words, alive with whispers of possibility. But if you listened closely, beneath the sigh of wind through tall stems, there was also a weight, a kind of sorrow for everything being swept aside so that someone else's vision could bloom. It was a fragile balance that would never quite steady again, a haunting mix of triumph and loss woven into every horizon. And it was this bittersweet paradox, perhaps, more than gold or good soil or wide skies, that defined the true soul of the Wild West, a place of staggering beauty, immense promise, and a hidden ledger of costs that could never truly be repaid.
Even now, long after the last cattle drives faded into history and the final frontier towns became quiet streets lined with asphalt and power lines, the ghost of the Wild West still rides alongside us. It lives in the books we devour, in films where broad-hatted men squint into the sun with hands poised near revolvers, in country songs that drawl about wide-open roads and hearts unbroken by fences. But more subtly, it has burrowed into deeper places, into how we understand risk and reward, how we measure independence, how we justify pushing past someone else's claim to chase our own bright, reckless vision. Ask almost anyone what the West means, and they'll likely paint it in bold strokes: freedom, self-reliance, the thrill of staking your life on nothing but nerve and hard hands. It's a compelling story. The rugged settler carving out a homestead from wilderness, the lone cowboy chasing horizon after horizon with only his horse and a stubborn grin, the miner striking pay dirt after years of clawing through stubborn rock. These myths glow so fiercely that their light still shapes national pride and personal fantasies alike. But the truth, coiled quietly underneath, is far more tangled. The same land that promised so much was often seized with little thought for the people already there. Policies born in distant capitals drew lines on maps that ignored ancient trails and sacred grounds. Laws that sounded noble on paper, granting homesteads to anyone willing to toil, masked a vast displacement that left scars still visible today in struggling reservations and lost languages. Economically, the boom of the West forged titans of industry who laid railroads and telegraph wires across the continent. But it also built cycles of exploitation, of laborers from around the world brought in under false pretenses, of fragile ecosystems churned under by plows too hungry, of rivers dammed and forests stripped bare. Politically, the push westward fed doctrines of expansion that later echoed in ventures far beyond these shores, each justified by a familiar conviction that might made right if it carried the promise of progress. Psychologically, the West left us with a restless itch. It carved into the cultural bedrock an idea that there's always a new place to go, a fresh start just over the next ridge, a belief so powerful that it blinds us at times to the harm done along the way. We celebrate mavericks who bend rules and break ties to forge ahead, rarely asking what or who lies crushed under their boots.
Yet, the legacy isn't solely dark. There's also a fierce resilience that arose from those hard days on the prairie and the range. The sense of neighborly duty, born of knowing help might be days away otherwise. The stubborn hope that kept sod houses patched through storm after storm, that held families together when locusts stripped fields bare. The songs, the tales told around low fires, the jokes shared even when bellies were empty. These too traveled forward in time, winding their way into the veins of the country's collective memory. So we inherit it all, the glittering myth, the gritty reality, the deep ache of wrongs never fully righted, and the bright flash of human endurance that somehow made a home in a place that resisted it at every turn. When people today speak of wide open spaces, of wanting to start over where no one can crowd them, they're echoing an old frontier longing that's as much cautionary tale as it is inspiration. Perhaps that's why the Wild West still holds us so completely. It stands as both a monument to breathtaking ambition and a mirror reflecting our most complicated truths, our dreams of unbound liberty, our blind spots to others' suffering, our endless capacity to romanticize struggle once it belongs to someone else. In that way, it remains forever alive, not just in dusty museums or sepia photographs, but in the choices we make, the stories we cherish, and the quiet, sometimes uneasy question we carry into new frontiers of every kind. At what cost and for whose benefit do we keep chasing horizons?